everyone. Thank you for joining me again. This is our sixth and final message in our series, Asked and Answered, shifting our mindset from expectation to revelation. And today we're going to be looking at the question that the woman of the well asked Jesus. It's found in John 4:11. The question is, where can you get this living water? Jesus responds to her in John 4:13 through 14, and he says, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." God bless the reading of his word. The desert of the soul. Beneath the broom tree I make my bed in the desert sand, a filthy rag gathering dust in the dryness of the land. My tongue is parched, my belly burns, sandaled feet scorched by. My convictions churn and merge with despair. Heat from an unforgiving sun turns my skin to leather. As my body swells, my spirit becomes a wisp, vapor wafting into dead air. I beg to die. Little life left within, my religion wearing thin, no longer fit, I choose to quit. But God has another plan, a dried out do-rag from Superman, poor choice for a clergyman. God has a use for me yet. But first to rest this aching flesh, beneath this tree convalesce, awakened now by angel touch. Upon my brow, at my head, a cake of bread, water jar and a thread of hope. Once again, an impulse to rest and sleep. I can travel no farther without infusion, body, mind, spirit, soul. Once refreshed, I stand, survey the land, and know the course mapped by God's hand, God's grand plan to use this broken, beaten man. I step into renewed purpose. A dream? Perhaps. Is this not where the desert of the soul manifests itself? Barren landscape devoid of cause, giving pause to raging seas, drained until only sand remains. In lonely, broken desert I find my source. As I lean into renewed purpose, I give up my soul as God brings forth springs of living water to quench my thirst. He brings the rain to refill the plain and make me whole, allowing me once again to serve my Creator with abundant joy. Excuse me. I have often talked about that farm that my parents had when I was growing up. Its footprint among my memories is an important part of my life journey. It gives me a great collection of stories to draw from. I do not know if it's because it occurred during my formative years, or because memories can just be powerful tools to deal with the world and the weariness around us. But I am grateful that God makes these memories available to me so that I can share them with you. Now, our farm was split into two sections, joined at one corner with a dirt access road that ran between them, and the road led to properties owned by other farmers and ranchers. When my parents first acquired the property, there was a stock tank on one of the sections. It was a rain-fed pond, and although I can only remember a couple of times that there was more mud than water, it was prone to having very low levels in times of drought. Dad leased the property to a cattle rancher, and the pond was the only source of water available for those cows. While a creek ran through the property, it only flowed when it was raining, and during the hot summer, the pond was vital for the survival of the cows. It was also a place for me to fish and explore. Dad had stocked it with catfish, perch, and bass, fed them with fish blocks. He did not stock the tank with water moccasins and snapping turtles. They seemed to have found their own way to the pond. I would often hang out a trot line in the evenings and return in the morning, pull up the line and find most of the hooks were occupied. Perch, bass, water moccasin, turtles, catfish. I'd kill the moccasins, free the turtles, and took the fish home for lunch. We built our homestead on the other section, right next to the corner where the properties joined. There was no stock pond on that section. Dad did have a well dug, and he chose where to dig that well with the divining rod. Now, I will tell you that I know that I have used a divining rod, and I never really found it to be all that accurate. But Dad believed in it, and where the rod said to dig, that's where the well went. He put a hand pump on that well head, and we used that hand pump for years. It served a limited amount of water. We were lucky to get 2 or 3 gallons at a time from the pump, and then we would have to wait a few hours for the well to refill. Well, perhaps the well wasn't quite deep enough. The water was very hard and laden with minerals, almost to the point of being undrinkable. So we often brought drinking water with us and used the well water to take baths, wash dishes, and wash up after a long day of work. Dad eventually put an electric pump on the well, but that had a number of issues since the well could only deliver a limited amount of water. It caused us to burn up several pumps. At one point, my dad told me that we were going to build another stock pond. Now, this one was on the section that we built the house on, but this stock pond was going to be a little different from the other stock pond in the well. About 200 yards from the house and on another corner of the property, there was a spring. It wasn't like a flowing, gurgling spring, but it kept that corner of the property pretty well much in a marsh state. And Dad decided to use the spring to feed the new stock pond, which is about twice as big as the old one. He hired a contractor to come out with his equipment, clear the land, and dig the pond. And it was everything Dad imagined. The pond never went dry. He stocked it with bass, perch, and catfish, just like the other one. And yes, the water moccasins and turtles found their way to this pond as well. Because of the spring, the water level remained fairly constant throughout the year. And I've often asked myself, I was a little afraid to question my dad's judgment. I looked up to him as a giant in my life, but I often asked myself why my dad didn't just run a water line from the spring rather than go to the expense of digging the well, a well that never quite met our needs anyway. We planted an orchard, apples, pears, and plums, near the house and not very far from the well. But I couldn't use the well water to water the orchard. There just wasn't enough water there to begin to meet the needs for the orchard. Dad made a wooden sled and put a 55-gallon drum on it. And I would take the tractor and pull the sled to the new stock pond, fill the 55-gallon tank with a bucket, and then I would haul the water back to the orchard to water the trees. It usually took about 10 trips to water all of the trees. And as much as I love my dad, I still think we could have tapped into that spring. Hauling water like that in a hot summer brought me little joy. But I'm sure there must have been something that I did not understand that prevented Dad from tapping that spring for more than just filling the new stock pond. So, to recap, the Wellborn Fern had 4 sources of water. A stock pond that was used by cattle that we did not own, and which also served as my favorite fishing spot. But it was susceptible to drought because it was rain-fed, and there was water in it that was not drinkable. The second source of water was the hand pump in front of the cabin. The water was heavy and bitter with minerals. It was difficult to drink. It was also not quite deep enough to make it a very useful thing, since it was a limited water resource. The third source of water was the newer second pond on a section of property where there were no cattle. The water was used mostly to keep the orchard hydrated. This water had to be hand delivered to the orchard, which was an extremely laborious process. This pond would not diminish because it was spring-fed and remained somewhat level year-round. Because this water remained muddy and dirty and contaminated, it also was not drinkable. The fourth source was the spring itself, but it had only been tapped as a resource for the second stock pond. Now, we've talked about the woman at the well before, and we've talked about living water before, but we've never really focused on the question we're looking at today. Where can you get this living water? There's so many unique lessons that come from this story of the woman at the well, and it would just be easy to stop and dwell on any of them. The fact that Jesus went out of his way to go through Samaria to find this woman is the first. The second is the fact that this well was in Samaria. It was not in Judah. And the fact that the first person to whom Jesus explains who he is a woman, a Samaritan woman, a sin-riddled Samaritan woman, a down on her luck, rejected, despised, divorced, sin-riddled Samaritan woman. She and I have so much in common. The fact that this well was dug by Jacob had strong ties to the Old Testament is another reason. The fact that this woman is at the well alone is another thing we could talk about. And the fact that Jesus uses this opportunity to discuss living water for the first time in his ministry. And by doing so, he steps into a common theme for his ministry, the heart of his message to all people. But right now, we want to focus on the question that the woman is asking Jesus. Where can you get this living water? Now, when we thirst for water, we usually have several resources to draw from. I want you to think back to my story today about the water resources on the farm when I was growing up. It's very similar to a parable, although my parables are not quite as insightful as those of Jesus. When we consider the water resources that my family had available, we first look at the original stock pond. Now, that pond was dependent on rain, so in times of drought, it was pretty useless. Sometimes we tie our lives to water sources that are dependent on a supply that is not always available. Resources that become unavailable in hard times. When we are totally reliant on limited resources, there will come a time when those resources are not available, and our lives will come crashing down around us as we scramble to seek out a new supply. If we are fixed on allowing other people to quench our thirst, what happens when those people leave us or desert us and we find ourselves scrambling to find some other resource to meet our needs? Usually when that happens, the source we find is inferior and we pay the price with our health, values, and lifestyles. Now, the second water source on the farm was a well pump. That water was very bitter and limited to the amount that could be pulled from it. It is like the people in our lives that remain uncommitted to relationships, only willing to give so much, and what they do give is laced with resentment and bitterness. They are convinced that giving of themselves is forced and coerced. Rather than thinking of it as giving out of abundance, they see others as taking resources from them, resources that are rightfully belonging to the giver, and the giver feels that they are owed something in return. After all, they only have so much to give and expect whatever they share to be replaced as quickly as possible. Water gathered from this type of relationship is seldom satisfying, and it always tastes bitter in our mouths. The third water source on the farm was the second stock pond fed by the spring. Now, this water was always there and available, but it was contaminated by the elements around it, mud, scum, and invisible parasites. Not something you would normally want to drink unless you were beyond desperate. You could dip your hat in it and cool your head, but it wouldn't quench your thirst. This is similar to those Christians around us that draw resources from Christ, but don't share them with others. It's a rather selfish way of living a Christian life, considering that the spring is forever refilling the lives of these Christians. They come to worship on Sunday. They leave worship full, but they never allow themselves to overflow. They partake of the table, but don't share that table with others. They never invite others to join them at the table because they feel that the table is exclusive and belongs to those already at the table. They can't seem to grasp that Jesus never meant for his resources to remain within the club, limited to the members. They don't quite understand that getting refilled for personal gain is, for all intents and purposes, totally contrary to the heart of the message that Jesus teaches us with regard to sharing. There is a reason that Jesus chose a down-on-her-luck, rejected, despised, divorced, sin-riddled Samaritan woman to share his living water with. He could have just as easily sought out a legal-minded, resentful, religiously associated, judgmental Pharisee who just happened to also be a man. But that would have been in total contrast to Jesus' message that the living water that he was sharing was for all people, even those we don't see eye to eye with, even those that we find contemptible, even those that have decided are unworthy to receive this abundant, refreshing water, because we see the fourth water of this source of water is serving as a purpose already. It is difficult for us to see that the spring water is underutilized. It was never tapped into to provide a refreshing quenching of our soul. And as Christians, though, we have chosen to tap into the living water that Christ provides. Jesus answered the woman's question, "But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Now I want you to think about one of those fountains where the water starts at the top, then trickles down into a container below it, overflowing, and that spills into another container which overflows into another container before the water finally reaches the reservoir. Now that's what Jesus is talking about here. He provides us with his living water. We overflow into the other people around us, who in turn overflow into the other people around them. And if we don't allow the water to fill us and overflow, if we just let the water fill the reservoir, we're only quenching our own thirst at the expense of meeting the thirst of those around us. Now, I'm not picking on anyone here, so don't take it personally, but I give each one of you a coin with the intent that you give it to someone else. Now, this activity is an example of how God's living water flows through us and into those around us. There really is no reason to hang on to the coin, and when you give it away, I give you another one. It is an example of how Jesus meant for this all to work. God provides me with the resources to give you the coins. It really doesn't matter who you give the coin to. I will give you another coin to replace it when you give it away. It doesn't matter who benefits when the love of Christ flows through you into others. He will refill you, and there is always an abundance to go around. He doesn't run out. So I want you to go make a difference in somebody's life this week. Give them a coin. Share the living water of Christ with them. Carry a box for them. Give them a drink. Pay for their meal in the drive-thru. Help that woman at the supermarket reach that container that's on the top shelf. Give somebody else a ride. Invite someone to church so that they can share this fellowship. Invite someone to the all-church breakfast or the fellowship lunch. Give someone a coin just because. Just because. Knowing that I'm going to give you another one to replace it. Where can you get this living water? There's only one source. There's only one faucet that we can turn on that will always provide us more than we can ever use. There is only one Jesus Christ who loves us so much that he gives his life for us so that we don't necessarily contain love, but so that we can allow love to overflow through us and into others. Amen.